And if you click on that, then you can find the questions, just in case you want to follow along. But I can also put the questions up just like Itai did. Yeah, Judd just posted the link to the website, so you can find it there.
Do you have to go back to this?
Well, yeah, the
No,
whole,
good.
it's
All right, well, enjoy.
it'll be very
Yeah,
moving.
yeah, I understand.
Okay, so Mark, would you like to give your 15-minute spiel?
Okay, normativity. Normativity is a problem. It just doesn't seem to fit with the world. Many people have, in fact, argued this in various ways. I would go back to Hume, whose argument basically consists of what seems altogether inconceivable, and that was sort of the extent of his argument. But the basic point of it is that there didn't seem to be any way to get normative concepts or terms in a valid sense out of strictly factual premises. I would argue that Hume's stance, as well as many other people, is an example of a dual metaphysics in which we've got the non-normative, quote, natural world, unquote, split from the normative world, the intentional world, and so on. If we have this split, there's only three possibilities. We either have an explicitly dual metaphysics, like Aristotle, among others, Descartes, and so on, or we try to make do with just the physical world, like maybe Hobbes and so on, or just the mental world, like various idealists. Richard calls these latter two one-legged Cartesianism. The basic split, I've argued, arises with Parmenides and persists for quite a long time since then. I would argue that there was a question about the importance. I would argue that everything biological and everything mental is intrinsically saturated with normativity, many different kinds of normativity, many different hierarchies, hierarchies, lattices, et cetera, of normative emergences, and that no account can be complete without accounting for such normativities, plural. The simplest form of normativity, it seems to me, is biological normative function. And I don't know if anybody really explicitly disagrees with that. I don't think Ruth does. But anyway, that's what I would argue. But accounting for the emergence of biological normative function requires a model of metaphysical emergence more generally, not just normative functional emergence. A model of metaphysical emergence more generally requires or is enabled by a process metaphysics. And a process metaphysics is both logically and physically consistent, unlike a substance or particle metaphysics. So the logical consistencies with quotes around logic shows up in the fact or the observation that if we had a universe consisting just of point particles, nothing would ever happen because the point particles have zero probability of ever hitting each other. They just go sailing around. If we introduce fields to account for particles maybe attracting or repelling each other, we already have process because fields are process. And that, of course, is what I'm aiming for. And then the consistent with physics issue has to do with the fact that in contemporary physics, the fundamental level or mode, if you want, of being is process. It's quantum field theory. And in quantum field theory, there simply are no particles. There are just simply quantized excitations of quantum fields. So a process metaphysics is both logically and physically consistent and preferable, and a substance metaphysics fails on both counts. But more than this is needed. We need more than just a process metaphysics. which can give us emergence, so I claim. Maybe I'll say a word or so about that. The sense in which a process metaphysics gives us metaphysical emergence is simply that the intuition of emergence is that new organization gives you something new in the way of influences on the world, and processes influence the world in strong part in terms of their organization. So it's kind of automatic that different organizations will give you different influences on the world. And furthermore, the strongest arguments against emergence, which are like Yagwan Kim's and so on, simply presuppose particles in the background, and the arguments don't work at all if you substitute a process framework. And so a process framework simply avoids, transcends, defeats, however you want to think of it, arguments such as those of Kim's. So we get emergence from a process framework, but we need more than that. We need some kind of a ground for the asymmetries of normativity. And this is a bit more difficult to find because physics itself gives us many, many distinctions, distinctions of energy levels, of wavelengths, of direction, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But it doesn't give any preference of one over the other. It doesn't really give us any fundamental, potentially grounding asymmetries. Thermodynamics, however, does give us a strong candidate for these asymmetries in terms of stabilities of different kinds. If we have a process organization that is stable, there are at least two different categories of these kinds of stabilities. One is what I would call an energy well stability, like an atom, in which the process will sit around unless and until something above threshold energy impinges on it to disrupt it. And the other are far from equilibrium stabilities, like my canonical example is the candle flame, that whose very existence is constituted in far from equilibrium process. And the asymmetry is that energy well stabilities can go to equilibrium, thermodynamic equilibrium, and be perfectly happy, whereas far from equilibrium systems cannot go to equilibrium without ceasing to exist. And far from equilibrium conditions require maintenance of those far from equilibrium conditions. Something go wrong can be just, oh, okay. I don't know what that was. So something has to maintain far from equilibrium stable organizations of any kind. Something has to maintain far from equilibrium conditions. And that's the asymmetry that I want to turn on. The basic intuition that I want to claim is that maintenance of far from equilibrium conditions is functional relative to the stability of those far from equilibrium organizations. It helps maintain it. That's one sense of function as usefulness, to refer back to some points being made earlier. And so that's how I would claim normative function emerges. It emerges most primitively in the maintenance of far from equilibrium conditions. It's a graded concept. We've got self-organization, we've got self-maintenance. Notice that a candle flame is not only self-organized, but it's also self-maintenance because it maintains above combustion threshold temperatures, induces convection that brings in oxygen, gets rid of waste products and so on. So it's self-maintenance in some fairly powerful senses. It is not recursively self-maintenant, but Don Campbell's bacterium is, because Don Campbell's bacterium can change what it's doing in response to changes in its condition, in its orientation to its environment. So if it's swimming and it's going up a sugar gradient, it will tend to continue swimming. But if it's swimming and going down a sugar gradient, then the swimming is no longer contributing positively to the self-maintenance of the bacterium, and it can detect that it's swimming down the sugar gradient, and instead of continuing to swim, it will tumble and then start swimming again. Eventually, it will tend to end up swimming up the sugar gradient. So the bacterium can change what it's doing. That is, it can self-maintain its condition of being self-maintenance. That's why I call it recursively self-maintenance. And I would take this graded concept as the beginning of an explication of autonomy. Autonomy is used in the language all over the place in this literature. I don't agree with all of the explications of it, and I would suggest this one. Let's see, there were other questions about closure and so on and so on. Do you want me to get into those now, or shall I wait?
Do you have anything else to present, or, I mean, you could always, I guess.
Well, okay, I can say some more about these concepts that were asked about in the questions.
Okay.
Closure is often used in the framework of autonomy. I find it to be a misleading notion for life and normativity. Maintenance, self-maintenance can often be thought of in terms of closure, but self-maintenance, in the way I explicate the term, is the maintenance of far from equilibrium conditions. It's not closure in the sense of the maintenance of components. It's not closure in the sense of the maintenance of constraints or constraint structures. And that's the sense in which I find the notion of closure to be powerful, but also misleading. It seems to me that what's crucial is the relationship between the system and the far from equilibrium conditions, and that's what has to be maintained. It's the maintenance of a relational phenomenon. It's not the maintenance of components, constraints, or anything that makes up the system per se. So in that sense, the notion of stability is the stability of far from equilibrium conditions and the process organizations that are being maintained by them, maintained as stable. It's not a stability of components or constraints. So that leads into this somewhat different notion of autonomy that I was suggesting. Autonomy, I think, is best understood in the sense of not autonomy from, but rather autonomy within. It's the systems being able to maintain the far from equilibrium conditions in this environment that constitutes autonomy. Another question about constraint. I would argue that constraint is one form or a range of forms, but it's only one range of forms of how processes can influence other processes. Constraint involves different timescales, and it involves different kinds of organizational stability. So a constraint might be being provided or dynamically implemented via something that's energy well. So if you've got something that's made out of concrete or steel or something like that, it's got an energy well stability, and within certain energy ranges, it will impose a constraint in virtue of the fact that anything tending to impinge upon it will tend to generate heat within it rather than disrupting the organization per se. Or you've got far from equilibrium constraints that just involve different timescales of far from equilibrium turnover, of open system turnover. So you've got cell walls, you've got structures within cells, you've got all kinds of things in bodies. They're all far from equilibrium. They are not stable in an energy well sense, but they do impose constraints, enabling constraints quite often, because they are at slower timescales than the things for which they provide constraints. But again, constraint is one notion, it's not the only notion of how processes can influence each other. And then finally, there was a question about normativity and its importance and so on. And I would simply comment that in most of this literature, cognitive science, psychology, and so on, normativity is simply mostly ignored or assumed, but rarely is there any attempt to account for it. People in this conference are sometimes exceptions to that, but there are exceptions to most of the literature. I would suggest that normativity needs the recognition of its ubiquitousness and its importance. And some form of semi-consensus about its nature would be nice, but maybe that's too much to hope for.
All right, thank you very much. Just a quick note, I made a mistake when I posted the questions earlier. I recycled a button that led to something to a zip file. So if you tried to download it and had that problem, just refresh the page and you'll be able to get the actual questions instead of the audio book that it was linked to before, in case you've already tried to do that. Of course, I'll be presenting the questions once that happens. All right, Tom Frosa.
Okay, thank you very much. Before I start sharing my screen, I just wanted to say that it's a great honor to be part of this panel. All my co-panelists were great inspirations, are great inspirations, and I've met you all at different stages of my career, and I've tried to build on all of your work. And Mark in particular, we shared the same conference. It was my first keynote presentation. I think it was back in 2012, the Foundations of Inactive Cognitive Science, I think it was the title. So it's great to be back on the same panel, almost 10 years later, and to continue discussing on these topics. So what I want to present today is some work in progress that hasn't been published yet, where I'm moving a little bit out of my comfort zone and trying out some new things. So I look forward to seeing what you guys think about it. I'm going to start sharing my screen. I won't go into full presentation mode so that I can still see you on the Zoom in the same way as before. So I hope this is good enough that you can read it. So it's actually a theory of consciousness that we're developing in my unit, in the Embodied Cognitive Science unit here in the Okinawa's Institute of Science and Technology. But it has also implications for normativity. I think, consciousness sometimes is like the pinnacle of thinking about normativity, but, normativity gets us to the foundation. So this will be relevant. So what do I want to do here is build on some actions that I think that we will all agree upon, and then see whether we can make them consistent. So it's kind of like a relaxed naturalism, my starting point. Number one is that we have the experience of subjectivity as such making a difference in the world. I mean, this is just supposed to be, agency is real. When I give this talk, I do it because I want to give this talk, just something like relatively trivial like that. But, it's not as trivial as it sounds, because as Kaufman has argued, there's a big difference between these kinds of doings and just mere happenings, like, the Earth going around the sun, and that's, of course, one of the core questions of normativity. When something makes a difference to someone, how do we account for that? And here's the second problem. Well, here is the problem. That is not a problem. That's just, our state of affairs, our existence. The problem is that there's no evidence of subjectivity as such making a difference in the world. And here I find very nice Deacon's phrase that these phenomena are absential. So if we look through the lens of natural science into the world, we never find goals as such, or functions as such, or representations as such. There are always vehicles which we then can assign to these other purposes, other functions, but we don't see the homunculus in the brain, right? We just see neural activity and chemistry and so on. So what's going on here? Does that mean that maybe axiom 1 has to be rejected, right? Maybe it's just an illusion, or maybe we have to reduce it, explain it away, or possibly, we have to settle for some kind of identity theory that, even though we can't find it, then at least, it will have some place in the universe. But I think we shouldn't rush too quickly onto some kind of theory like that, and just stop for a moment and consider axiom 3, which is that it is also impossible in practice and in principle to fully derive doings and happenings from physics alone. Right? There's an undetermination happening at the level of nature, which if you talk to physicists, for them, that's not even like, crazy. Ever since quantum physics, nature has been non-deterministic at its very foundations. So non-determinism is not something that is mysterious. It's already like part of the natural order in the natural sciences. So that means that actually, to some extent, there is a possibility for things that are non-physical to potentially make a difference in the physical, except that they would be expressed not, as a physical determination, as long as things are incomplete and underdetermined, basically. So this is then where I want to introduce this notion of eruption, which will form the core of this theory, which I want to define as a sudden increase in the occurrence of underdetermined physical events during the realization of our bodily happenings. right? And then so the working hypothesis that subjective doings as such, as subjective, can make a difference to our bodily happenings and, so to speak, turn them into doings in terms of eruptions, physical events that are physically undetermined. And so why eruption? I had a look around for a term that could kind of convey this idea of that we're breaking into the natural order from within the organism. And so eruption seemed to capture that quite nicely. And also I was quite happy to see that the word origin from Latin, irrompere, or from rompere, has this notion of break or burst. And I will return to Ashby's famous notion of breaks and ultrastability in a moment. So here are the key questions that I'd like to address with this theory. One is individuality. How is it possible that our bodily happenings are associated with a subjective perspective that is engaged in normative doings? And I think actually all of our panelists have their own versions of how to account for this. We just heard Mark talk about process philosophy and emergence of normativity. And I think we have different versions of exactly how we conceive of that process. But I think on that respect, we are on relatively solid ground, and we've made a lot of progress in thinking about how it could be that something is normative. But what we have done less thinking about is, once we have this normativity in place, how could that normativity as such make a difference to what happens in the world, rather than just being something epiphenomenal where we experience things as normative, but actually it has absolutely no consequences in how the world unfolds, right? So I have to address at least two things here. One is unobservability. Like I said, I don't want to suddenly say, hey, actually there is a homunculus in the brain. We just haven't seen it yet, right? No, I don't want to go down that way. So I have to say something about how these eruptions remain unobservable. And the second point is that, if they come in and erupt the natural order and create lots of non-determined or underdetermined events, then the question is, well, how could that even be useful, right? Because then, people will say, well, that's just random. That doesn't help us really in our problem. So I'm going to try to address these very briefly. The first point, which I think our other panelists will delve into deeper, so I'll just touch it briefly. I also want to argue that life is a special kind of dissipative structure that that has these extra features, that it creates its own conditions, material conditions. It actually creates new molecules that wouldn't exist otherwise in the universe. And it does this regulatory work, and we can slot in very nicely here all these notions. And Mark Bickert just mentioned his term of recursive self-maintenance, which I think is a very neat encapsulation of this idea. And then I would try to bring a little bit of phenomenology into that, and say that things matter to a living organism because its doings are internally related to its very existence in a constitutive manner. So it's this precariousness of creating your own existence and having to regulate and maintain that existence, which is the reason why things matter to that that entity. Okay, here's the kind of like updated version of how enactive cognitive science thinks about it. We start from this classical notion of autopoiesis, which is self-production, where you have self-individuation on the one hand, but also coupling with the environment on the other hand. And if you were to look at these two aspects of autopoiesis, in order to kind of optimize them, if you wanted to do, say, optimize the flow of energy and matter through the system, you would opt for complete openness, but then you would be not have any individuality left, so there's a constraint there. And on the other hand, if you want to emphasize the part of the individual in contradistinction to its environment by creating a boundary around it, well, then you're constraining the flow of energy and matter through it. So these are opposing goals that can never be fully satisfied. And agency and regulation comes in and actually creates this kind of metastable balance between these two conditions. And that's where, in my mind, the origin of normativity sits, like briefly said. So then the next key question, unobservability. Here take inspiration from Hans Jonas, who has also been very influential in developing these enactive account normativity. And he was thinking about how is it possible that we could have a way of talking about freedom and responsibility in a way that is not inconsistent with our best account of nature. And he had this idea that, well, first of all, now that we have quantum physics, we know that there is a non-determinism at the core of the universe, but how do we scale it up? And here he was already thinking very much ahead of his times in terms of dynamical systems theory. If you think about an unstable equilibrium point, like a cone sitting on its head, right? Then, mathematically, that's a stable situation, right? But any infinitely small perturbation from the side will make the thing fall over, right? So actually in practice, this is totally impossible. You'll never be able to put it on that tip. But given that, the perturbation that can have this macroscopic effect is actually, infinitely small, it's actually unmeasurable. So to some extent, it's in principle unobservable. You could have an unobservable effect causing such a macroscopic collapse of the object. So I think that, there's more work to be done here, but I think Hans Jonas gives a very nice start on how to possibly think about this. A little bit more metaphorically, given that I'm sitting here in Japan, is that if we wanted to look for where eruptions make their occurrence inside the organism, I think we should have to look at the smallest spatiotemporal scales. So, underdetermination is more likely to happen, at the little frothy stuff sitting on top of the waves rather than the huge body of the actual wave below. But if that's the case, then the question is, how can these like in tiny, fluctuations of froth make a difference for how the big wave moves, right? And where the big wave might be, the behavior that we're trying to enact. And, there are now ideas that in some systems, this picture somehow sits on its head, actually, that it's like tiny, tiny fluctuations, which have macroscopic effects down the line. It was chaos originally, which kind of like made this popular with the idea that, if a butterfly flaps its wings, suddenly you'll have a hurricane on the other side of the world. So we know now that there are natural processes that can be very sensitive to the microscopically smallest differences and lead to macroscopic effects. But still, even if we have this scaling up effect, this still then leads to the problem of how could that do useful work, right? If it's just magnifying some sort of like random non-deterministic fluctuation in the bottom level, well, that would be totally useless. Right? We would be just flopping around, in some sort of weird state. So what's interesting here is that there's another line of research coming from Ashby and cybernetics and going into complex adaptive systems where actually stochasticity and noise plays the key role for getting adaptive behavior to come out of the system. So I think actually these two things slot in very neatly together and give us a kind of coherent package. So two things that I'm particularly interested in is that Ashby's ultrastability, where you have stability reorganizing itself after the system breaks, these breaks he defines as random step functions, actually. And then some more recent work from some colleagues in Southampton, they found out that if you have a kind of simulated annealing type of optimization of states, and you add a little bit of Hebbian learning into this, which is non-supervised learning, what you get is that the system starts acquiring associative memory of its attractor landscape, and then starts generalizing in such a way that it finds global optima much more rapidly than it would ever find under normal conditions. So I think that, there's some work here that can be slotted in very nicely, where you're saying, hey, if you have a big random push coming up from below, if it feeds into one of these architectures, actually what it's doing is generating adaptive behavior in the long term. Okay, so just to kind of like wrap this up and to leave time also for the other panels and more questions. So this is how they kind of like see the general architecture of this. One component will be the individual level, which I think we've done a lot of good work on. There's a lot of interesting concepts here where we have the emergence of normativity in a living being. In those general terms, I think we all agree on that. And then the question is, what kind of specific soup do we want to mix together in order to make that happen? Like, for example, recursive self-maintenance could be one way of thinking about this. But then I want to add this additional key ingredient that once we have normativity in place, in order for it to make difference as normativity, rather than just as something that supervenes on or is identical with a material basis or process, physical process, we need something else. And here I want to put in this notion of eruption, that we have some kind of, we take advantage of the underdetermination of nature to make room for the possibility of an eruption, which then in the right conditions of chaos or self-organized criticality is scaled up to the level of the organism as a whole, or sufficiently large that it can then impact the organism's behavior. And at that level, then this kind of fluctuation basically feeds into one of these unsupervised adaptive mechanisms in order to guide the behavior of the agent. And habits is also here, is another one. So we have work basically looking at habituation and how habituation is to some extent the foundation of our embodied skills and embodied intelligence. But if you have too much of that, you get OCD, right? You basically get into a loop where you keep repeating the same behavior and you can't break out. So what I want to say here is that, we're basically providing the other side of that. What agency and subjectivity does for us is give us the possibility to transition between these kinds of states. It allows us to break out of habituated patterns of activity. But the habituated patterns of activity are kind of like self-organized, self-constituted just through the material physical processes. That's we have that very much in place. But once we have room for normativity as such to make a difference, actually all of these different branches of cognitive science and complex system science come together in a way in which I think we can move this debate forward, where it's no longer just trying to argue that we need to make room for the emergence of normativity or the existence of normativity, which then still has this question mark of, is it just epiphenomenal or not? And then actually move more strongly forward and saying, no, it's not epiphenomenal. It actually makes a real difference. And it does so without breaking any known facts about the universe. All right, so with that, thank you very much for your attention, and I'll stop sharing.
All right, thank you very much. Let me set my timer. All right, Terry.
All right, thank you. I'm going to share my screen as well. I'll try to go through just very quickly some of the things I talked about previously. So let me just bring it right up there. Should do it. Is this visible to those of you out there?
Yes.
All right. So what I presented before this, I'm not a philosopher by training, but a scientist. That is, I work in the nervous system and in the evolution and development of nervous systems. But in the process of thinking about the problem of normativity, of representation, and so on, I've developed a very simple model system. I tried to outline it last time I was here. I've been working on it for a little over a decade. And it's based upon a pretty simple molecular analogy to a virus, what I call a hypothetical non-parasitic virus. I don't think it's just hypothetical. I think we'll actually discover non-parasitic viruses quite soon. They just won't be in the part of the world where we have parasitic viruses and living systems. And I can explain that if someone has a question about it. The point of all of this is that a virus is very simple. And I want to argue that viruses are normative, that viruses have functions. And we know this because we can work against them. They have in a sense, their own norms. And we've been in the process the last year and a half of trying to work against the norm of a virus. Viruses aren't alive in this full sense of the word. That is, they're not constantly dynamic. They don't carry their own energy. They don't generate their own parts. They're parasitic. What would a non-parasitic virus be like? It would work the way other viruses do, with a self-assembling shell and have to reproduce all of its parts somehow. And that's really the question. I consider this what I would call a minimal empirically realizable model system. And the reason I want to use this kind of a model is that eventually we'll be able to look at this and say there are no unknown processes here. These are all chemically, physically realized processes. We see them in life and so on. So let me move on to this next image. I put four together here. The key to this is that I realized at some point in time that two processes that we find characteristic of lots of living processes, reciprocal catalytic processes and self-assembly processes, are actually critical to this whole story. And that's because they tend to be processes, they're both self-organizing, that is, they run spontaneously if they're in some kind of a gradient. And what happens in this process is they each produce boundary conditions for the other. That is, the self-assembly process constrains dispersion of molecules, and reciprocal catalysis requires it. Reciprocal catalysis produces asymmetric concentrations of molecules, and self-assembly requires that. So the two of them have a kind of reciprocity. And this caught my attention because it allows us to go back to the viral story and say that which can substitute for the RNA or DNA in a virus could in fact be an autocatalytic process. And an autocatalytic process has a kind of a closure. Of course, it's always open, but it's self-organizing in the sense that it's reciprocal, it's recursive in that process. Self-assembly is not in the same way, but it depends upon a process that is also spontaneous. So I created two model systems out of this. I didn't go into details, I will not today, about how they might work, but chemically they're completely realizable. And what I like about a model of this sort is its complete realizability. That is, it will produce testable hypotheses and can probably be produced in the laboratory. We may find these systems, for example, deep down in the earth at some point in time. I actually think you'll find what I would call autogenic viruses in deposits of petroleum deep in the earth. Why? Because they're capable of using the local large molecules and are not competing with other living processes. In any case, the point I want to make about this is when you link these together by virtue of having the autocatalytic cycle produce, it's over here, so I can see what I'm doing, produce a capsid, a self-assembling capsid, it will tend to capture the very catalytic processes that produce that, but then close it off, stop the process, so that it's only under the conditions when the system is breached that it will begin this work cycle of producing more catalysts and more self-assembling molecules, essentially putting the thing back together again. And as a result, what we see is that it's a kind of closure, but it's not closure in the simple sense. It's a completely open system in one sense. It just simply alternates between closure and openness. And the important thing is that the boundary conditions for these two processes are each produced by the other. And that's what I try to capture in this image down here in the bottom right. And by that, what we see is that as a result, what might be extrinsic effects now become intrinsic, so that it will have internal reaction capabilities that are different than just any kind of inert or otherwise sort of spring-loaded system. This is a system that has an intrinsic, you might say, dissipation process that stops its own dissipation process and puts itself back together again. So it internalizes what would have been externalized boundary conditions. And so what we're really interested in is how something like agency, how intrinsic capacities come to be. And so I try to capture it in this fairly complicated, but I think you'll see otherwise fairly simple model, where the system is closed, nothing is happening, but when it's damaged extrinsically so that it pours its contents out, the various interacting intrinsic constraints begin the process of putting it back together again, but using energy and resources from the environment. What constraints are is they simply limit processes that can happen. Constraints, you might say, are absent. They're not there, or they're basically restrictions on what happens. But they're restrictions based upon the interactions or relationships between the parts that limit the kinds of energetic processes that can take place. As a result, it will eventually repair itself, and it involves doing work. And in this process, what happens is the constraints themselves, which are not any particular material thing, get preserved and get reproduced into another system. And every time it breaks up, new substrates are brought in, new energy is brought in, but the constraints are never lost. And the important thing here is that I think this is our key to understanding both information and normativity. And the reason for this is that constraints, because they are preventions, because they're simply absences, relationships, they stand apart from the dynamics, but they are what structure the dynamics. And what's happening here is these are constraints that reproduce themselves, maintain themselves across time, and are both a record of a previous system that maintains those constraints, a constraint relationship that maintains itself. But it's also an instruction for how those constraints can be reconstructed, maintained. And so what I want to suggest is that this is a kind of a ratchet effect in which the constraints, although they must be embodied, they are substrate transferable. Because they're substrate transferable, they have this marvelous capacity of, in a sense, in the right construction, that is in the right relationship to each other, they become themselves self-maintaining. So what's maintaining itself here are the constraints themselves. This is why it's a little hard to fathom in a fully materialistic perspective, because constraints are not the material. They simply require some kind of substrate. This simple system, I think, actually captures in very minimal sense 5 of the main capacities we're after, including normativity and recursive self-maintenance. And let me just focus on the bottom 3. Recursive self-maintenance, which I think is a brilliant conception that Mark has produced over the years, is captured by this system because it repairs and replicates the critical boundary conditions that are required to repair and replicate these same critical boundary conditions. That's literally recursive self-maintenance. It's normative in the sense that it's disposed to achieve and maintain this specific recursive self-maintenance, despite the fact that the world, the second law of thermodynamics, is in a sense working in the opposite direction. What we've talked about is how a system maintains itself in existence if, in fact, its entire existence is in risk. Is at risk? Is it ready to be dissolved, even internally, that is, towards equilibrium? We have to have a system in which the constraints reproduce themselves. And I think this leads to basically an interpretive capacity. I think of this simple system as the first, simplest, and bottom end of the interpretive capacity. By interpretive, of course, I don't mean anything as complicated as mind. And I think it's dangerous for us to think that it's mind all the way down. I think there's a series of emergent steps that we have to talk about to go from simple living systems, and here a system even simpler than most living systems, all the way up to mind. It's going to take a few steps. Obviously don't have time to talk about that, but let me just say that in this process, I've tried to envision 2 variants, 2 complications on this process that help us get to both evolvability and the kind of complex representational relationship and normative relationship that we want to get to and talk about. The first one has to do with an autogenic viral-like process that is sensitive to the environment, that will pick out features of the environment in a normative way. And how might that happen? The fact that the system requires substrates in order to repair itself or reproduce itself. That is, if it pours parts out, they will begin the process of constructing, maybe in a separate position, a new copy, that is to reproduce. But if the surface itself is sensitive to substrates, so that substrates bind to its surface, it becomes weaker and tends to break open, then it will tend to reproduce only or primarily or most probably in the context of an environment where there's lots of substrate available. So here we have a system that is dynamically changes its state with respect to its environment in a way that is preferential to maintaining that capacity. So again, there's a recursive self-maintenance here, but now a recursive self-maintenance with respect to a normative assessment of its environment. The 3 models on the right, the 3 panels on the right, basically capture a way to complicate this process one step further and take us to the point where we can talk about the kind of information that we tend to think about in terms of life. And that involves the fact, and I won't talk our way into how we get there, but that polymers like DNA or RNA, actually the sequence, we think about the sequence of base pairs in these systems as arbitrary. In fact, that's true, but it does not just have an arbitrary effect. And that is, it changes the shape of these molecules. That is, the shape of the molecules is determined, as the 3-dimensional spiral-like shape is determined by the sequence. And that means each sequence will have a very specific shape associated with it. And what we now know is that particularly molecules like proteins tend to stick to the surface, bind to the surface by virtue of shape similarities. And so the shape of the DNA or RNA molecule actually plays a role in determining how proteins bind to it. And by the way, proteins bind to both DNA and RNA. And this is one of the reasons that RNA, for example, can play such an elaborate role in the rest of the cell, not just in encoding DNA sequences. But it also means that the sequence of base pairs in one of these molecules will actually determine the relative positions of different proteins. And I'm going to argue that let's treat these as catalysts. That's what will happen is if you have a template of this sort that's constructed to some extent at random, it will be random, but it will determine the relative positions of these, which will determine their interaction capabilities, the tendencies for catalysts to interact. And what's crucial for a system with lots of parts is you have to constrain out the interaction possibilities that are not conducive to reproduction and maintain only or prioritize those that are. This is another normative feature about organisms. They have internal norms. They have to preference some chemical interactions and inhibit others, constrain others. This is a constraint process. And what this shows you, although this is not the way DNA and RNA work currently, the argument is that one way to move into a context in which a template can now carry information about the normative operative relationships of the whole system that it's a part. You need to have this kind of relationship. Notice that this also involves likeness relationships and correlation or contiguity relationships. And I'm going to point this out as we move forward because this hierarchy, which involves likeness or isometric or homomorphic relationships and contiguity relationships, is really the key to building this system to higher and higher levels of complexity. Yeah.
Terry?
Yeah.
You're at 15 minutes.
All right. Let me just end. I won't go into those details, but this is just a sort of a picture of this relationship in which now what's critical about this is now a part is carrying constraints that are effectively affecting its dynamics that determines the whole. It's a part that carries a record and a set of instructions about the whole. And it's this that makes it possible, and I'll just jump to the last slide here, that makes it possible to build level upon level of representational and normative relationships dependent upon each other. And although I can talk you through this, you saw it in my presentation as well. It helps us understand how you can build levels of systems of information and normativity that allow you to build complex bodies. And I would suggest if we were to go on from this, complex nervous systems and eventually complex communication systems that allow us to be as normative and representational as we are as human beings. So I better stop there. I'm sorry. I went over.
All right, thank you very much. And last but not least, Alvaro Moreno.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for the invitation. And thank you, Mark, for the very nice occasion to discuss your magnificent work. And that's what I will try to, first of all, to give you an acknowledgement, because you have done a very, very good work in at least in what concerns the question discussed in this panel, which is normativity and basic concept of function or minimal function, which I agree is a biological function. Now, nowadays there are many people that agrees that we cannot really give a naturalistic account of biology, of life and mind without the concept of normativity, because they are completely organized in terms of processes that are really right or wrong working. And although this idea is nowadays widely accepted, widely not means that unanimously at all, but widely accepted, one of the points that you have criticized, and this point I will follow you, is that there is not a Darwinian theory that permits grounding a naturalistic account of norm, and function. Now, my point is not so much because the question of historicity versus current organization, but because, in my view, the theory of evolution by natural selection, which of course grounds some type of functions, but it in fact requires a basic idea of functionality because it supposes a concept of organism. And the concept of organism that Darwin supposed, because it supposed that there is a phenotypic domain in where selection takes place, it's the core where we have to ground this theory of normative function. This is my first introductory remark. The second is that this basic, let's call that this basic account or basic theory of normative function, nevertheless has some incompleteness and very important ones. And the one that I want to mention here in the introductory remark is the difficulty for grounding outside of any theory of evolution meta rules that account for adaptive regulation. And I will try to explain a little bit more this question, but one thing is to give an account of how emerged a normative domain. Another thing is to give an account of these domains, these functions, as gradual, as doing something that is still a function, but is malfunctioning. And this is something which is much more difficult. And last but not least, in this introductory remark, is that all this, the relationship between the first point and the second point, requires a kind of connection between the organization of the basic organization of proto-organisms or organisms or proto-organisms and the organization of an historical, wider populational domain, and how these two dimensions are entangled and how the question of cross-generation functions emerge. That's for my introductory remarks. So next I will discuss a little bit the question of why I think that there are two fundamental concepts and how these fundamental concepts are related for accounting this, what I have called basic theory of normative functions. One is the idea of constraint, which I take not only as an epistemological concept, but as an ontological one. Now, for converting, so to speak, the use that is normal in physics for descriptions of constraints into a ontological concept, we need two requirements. One is the idea of far from equilibrium causal loop, and the other is the concept of thermodynamic micro interlevel causal action. Constraints become ontologically local causal factors if and only if the material structure where they are embodied enter in a closed loop. And this in turn depends on many factors. The appearance of a set of interactions occurring at a certain spatial and temporal scales, the appearance and maintenance of a very specific set of boundary conditions, the appearance of a process of self-assembly, that is large sets of material structures, mainly diverse molecular structure, enter into webs of interaction maintained in far from equilibrium conditions. Let's have a minimal example, an hypothetical prebiotic autopoietic system. The membrane is a macroscopic constraint because it harnesses the microscopic trajectories of the molecules at its interior. But in turn, these constrained molecules generate catalysts which harness other processes which ultimately and recursively generate the membrane. This is a very idealistic example. Things are much more complex, but this is the basic idea that I want to explain, that the idea of constraints that can make a sense as things that operate causally is something that implies that, as recently I have listened the expression, very helpful expression by Terry, constraints are internalized boundary conditions. It seems to me a very good metaphor. There are like very local structures that in their neighbors concerning their microscopic trajectories of the molecules act as a parameter, a local structure that constrains, and that's why the essence of constraint is a difference in scales. And only through these conditions altogether can we have a process of self-determination that explains the process of emergence. And that's why we need a kind of closure in the sense of a loop in far from equilibrium conditions, not something that is close to relations with the environment, not something that implies that there are the very same constraints, but that something that fulfills the condition that we need for defining a function as some X process or structure that is there because the effects it produces. And this is the core of the concept, the concepts of dynamical presupposition. But this implies something that closes, a kind of cyclic process. Although this process can change, but can fulfill the condition of closing a causal loop. Now, this is essentially what I think is what there are minimal conditions for emerging what I have called a normative domain. The problem is that this normative domain is not enough for explaining the question of when the system distinguishes when it's approaching the limits of viability. Imagine and this is an example that has been mentioned by Ezequiel Di Paolo in a paper in 2005. Imagine an autopoietic system where there are different constraints, and the system as a whole has some range of viability. So the key system can be relatively flexible, relatively plastic, relatively even robust. But the system is blind when, for given circumstances, environmental or internal, is approaching the boundary, its boundary limits. And then is no mechanism within the system to modify something in order to avoid or to make something in order to modulate the activity of the constraint in this system so as to try to avoid destruction. So the system has no way to detect whether something is some functional constraint is well functioning or malfunctioning. And for introducing this concept, which is very important, we need a meta rule. This meta rule actually cannot be originated but in an evolutionary history. because it requires a new scale time and scale of space. We need a lot of minimal basic functional system that reproduce, that compete, where there happens a selective process so that some constraints within these systems act as a form of offline with respect to the basic constitutive machinery or organization, and trigger when some measurement indicates that this meta rule indicates that this meta constraint should act. And this, as I have already mentioned, cannot be originated but this way. So we need to introduce another additional change in the scale into the system. My last point is that this leads us to a very important new problem, because if we want to explain all that from an organizational perspective, we need to give an account of what has been called cross-generation functions. Cross-generation functions raises problems for an organizational view. Which problems? Well, basically the question that if we ask which is the contribution of a trait or a process that plays a role as in a reproductive process, we should answer that it will contribute to the maintenance of some identity through the process of reproduction. In other words, it should contribute to the type of identity, not the token of the identity, although this process has a continuity in terms of organization. So there's some form of paradox. We have always a continuity in organizational terms, speaking in terms of tokens. But on the other hand, when we want to answer which is the contribution of this reproductive function, the answer is because it contributes to the continuity of some lineage. So to the continuity of the maintenance of similar but physically separated tokens. That is what we call a type. And this is something which introduces conceptual difficulties. That's what I consider that this is an open question, like the other one. And the more general question is the necessity to give an account that merge many different scales. So the scale between the microscopic and the macroscopic, which is the one of the closure of constraints that happens at the level of protocells or organisms, but also another one in which we have a larger, probably ecological organization, in which we have a historical, but historical means here another scale of time and space that forms also a form of self-maintenance linked with the organization of the tokens that belong to this greater system. And this is basically what I wanted to raise here. More questions than answers. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you much. Okay, so now we begin phase 2. This is, allow me to first if you want to follow along on your own, I just pasted the questions PDF, the link to it, into the chat, and you can click on that. But I also am going to share it on the screen. If I can just get it onto this monitor. Zoom meeting, share screen. Okay, so you should be seeing a PDF. Is that what you see?
Yes.
Okay, good.
Not quite
So-
readable.
Well, okay. Just one quick note, one thing that if you're scrolling around in it, I pasted material that I thought was relevant at the end of this questions PDF. So if you're unfamiliar with some of this stuff, you can at least find it in here to get some clarification. Okay, so let me make this bigger. Is this big enough?
A
Yes.
little bigger.
Okay. Did you say make it bigger?
No. This is good.
Okay. All right, so question number 1. I'm gonna reverse the order. Okay, so Mark's gonna go last. And Alvaro, you're gonna go first.
Okay.
So it'll be Alvaro, Terry, Tom, and Mark. Okay, I'm
Okay.
gonna ask the question and then the 4 of you will give your answers and then we can have some discussion.
I'm sorry
All
to
right.
interrupt, but Adrian, we don't have the link of this PDF in the chat, so.
Oh, bloody hell, I do this every time. I probably sent it to somebody specific.
Hmm.
Yeah, I sent it to Jed. Sorry. Okay. Alrighty, so what role does normativity play in your theory of life and mind, or that to which you subscribe? Some related issues that I have here are, how much weight does it carry? And what role does it play when developing ontologies and models for other aspects of life and mind? What role should normativity play in any theory of life and mind? And then this one is kind of a side issue, but it might be worth addressing. Is normativity just an ascription made by observers? If so, why do we ascribe at all? And what accounts for the observer's ascriptions? Why do they ascribe function and dysfunction, good and bad? How do they know anything about normativity at all if it's just an ascription? Okay. Alvaro?
Yeah. I think in part of my talk I have answered some aspects, but why ascribe normativity at all? Because biological science and psychological science cannot work without the use of normative notions. And when they try to do that, they implicitly do that. And so, if we want to be fair, it's better to try to look directly at the question and see how things happen. So we can describe things, but describe things in terms of values, not natural values. We are not speaking about moral. In terms, for example, of when for an organism, the environment is nothing, is full of things that are good in the sense of making contributions for their precarious organization. In that sense, precarious is far from equilibrium, and far from equilibrium means that this system has to do things structure constraints to maintain himself or itself. And that's why the environment is full of opportunities or dangers or neural things. This is the first thing. Of course, these are very basic and that I have called a normative domain. We have to add more things, but this is the fundamental framework. So it's not only a question that we ascribe, because this is the specific form of organization of biological systems, but not of chemical system nor or physical system. In physics, there is no functionality or no norms, because things happen, and unless there are some form of dynamical presupposition with such and such and such conditions that we have already mentioned, the use of terms of norm or function is completely trivial. So if we want to use the terms in a very minimal sense, but in a meaningful sense, we have to use a normative vocabulary for describing at least the transition between physical and chemical world to a biological world. And of course, from there on, I don't know if there are more questions that I have not answered.
I think that's okay. What would you say, just in a definitive statement, is the role that normativity plays in your theory? If different from what you've already said.
The role of normativity in my own theory.
Yes.
Well, I have work trying to naturalize biological organization, and I have worked especially in the transition between the field of origin of life or synthetic biology. And one of the things that I try to understand is how these relationships between, for example, a historical process that deserves the name of evolution, not trivial sense of mere processes, but evolution in the sense of used by Darwin. Then we need a kind of phenotypic domain, and underlying the phenotypic domain, there is the need to speak in terms of function. So the concept of metabolism or basic metabolism implies to speak in terms of functions, functional relations. That's what one of the important aspects. Another thing, another domain in which I have worked and I am now working is the distinction between cognitive processes from biological ones. And this is an aspect that I have no time for discussing here. It's very complicated, but I think that there emerged another form of normativity. But let's
All right.
take this question, which is very complex, aside by the moment.
Okay.
Mhm.
Great. All right. Now, Tom, or sorry, Terry.
All right, thank you. So the first question is, what role does normativity play in my theory of life and mind? I won't talk about mind today, we haven't gotten that far. But basically, and this follows directly from Mark's comments, that is, I'm arguing that we're talking about the origins of what I would call normative chemistry. Chemistry that in a sense has an end, has someplace that it's going. Organisms are the first time that chemistry becomes normative. There is no normativity in chemistry or physics outside of living processes. And so to some extent, the very concept of life, the very concept of mind is normative. But I want to make it clear that I think of it as normative chemistry. That is, it's the natural world, and the natural world is taking particular courses of dynamics. But in effect, it's the natural world. The norms are not outside of it. But as Tom mentioned also, my perspective is that norms are to some extent the negative. of the physical world. That is, they're there, they're active in the same sense that the hole in the middle of the donut actually has a place in the middle of the donut, even though there's no donut there. To some extent, that's the nature of norms, that they're preventions, they're absences. The other thing that's important, and this also comes from Mark's perspective where we agree entirely, and that is that these norms are emergent. Normative chemistry was not there after the Big Bang for probably billions of years. With something like life, normative chemistry comes into being. But that means that the norms emerge from individuals. And this is a sort of an interesting twist on the standard argument between nominalism and realism, that is the belief that generals truly exist. I think norms are generals in the classic philosophical sense, but norms in the world emerge in individuals and from individual forms. And I think it's important to recognize that. The other thing that's important to recognize, and that we have not really talked about today, is that the normativity of life and the normativity of mind are not the same normativity. A way I would put it is that mental normativity emerges from and depends upon living normativity, but not vice versa. There is not the kind of mental normativity in the autogenic viruses that I talk about, in bacteria and so on, in plants and so on, but they do have a kind of normativity. There are things that are good for plants, bad for plants, things that they tend towards and tend to shy away from. So I think one way I want to talk about it is that there are emergent stages of normativity, that is, or phases of normativity, in which we find that the normativity of creatures with minds is emergent upon the normativity of creatures that just have what you might call physiological or functional normativity. I use the word intention as opposed to intention to talk about these, but the terminology is irrelevant here. What I would say is that there are a number of stages. I actually think that the concept of true and false that we talked about originally, I didn't catch much of that early conversation because I was still asleep. But nevertheless, I think that's a very late stage that shows up with respect to linguistic symbolic communication. And the intersubjectivity eventually that comes with it leads to sort of even higher norms, higher level norms that we might call associated with moral or ethical dimensions of normativity. These are emergent normativities, and I think every stage, every phase of normativity has to emerge from a lower phase in a dependent way, in an emergent way. Let me just move to a lower question about observers. And I think it's important to recognize that the very concept of an observer is normative. It's not that you have some sort of normative agent outside of the world looking at the world and ascribing norms to the world, because you ultimately have to explain how the observer is normative. And the point I want to make here is that we take the concept of observer and just sort of flip it around and recognize that what we're talking about is a locus of normative assessment. Then every organism, including viruses, in a sense, are a locus of normative assessment. And as a result, the concept of an observer is a trick, this sort of Cartesian trick of standing outside the world and looking back at it. We're in the world, as are all organisms, and therefore they're observers in that sense.
All right.
The final thing I want to say, and I'll stop at this point, is that we got to make the distinction between existing and being. Rocks exist, but creatures that have to resist the second law of thermodynamics are beings. They have to constantly do work. Work is necessary to exist for a system that's far from equilibrium.
Very good. Thank you much. All right, Tom.
Okay, thank you. I just want to echo something that Alvaro and Terry said, is that for me, really, even the origins of life is really closely associated with normativity. And I just wonder whether, whether some of the enduring mystery of the origins of life and our incapacity to truly generate new life under laboratory conditions doesn't relate with our incapacity to understand normativity, probably. So it's quite fascinating to think that maybe, the origins of life around 4 billion years ago was the origin of normativity in the otherwise indifferent universe, right? So in that sense, you know, it was like a qualitative shift in the entire, you know, configuration of the universe. Suddenly something, you know, makes a difference to something, and before there was nothing like that. So I just, you know, I really find that very fascinating to think about. But I want to say, you know, maybe I want to raise the bar a little bit and something else, and turn this into a kind of meta reflection. Why is normativity important? Because if we didn't have it, nothing would matter. And that includes science too, right? I mean, you can't do science without normativity. So if science can't account for normativity, it can't account for itself. And it's, you know, or if it was forced into a position where there was no room for normativity, it would become self-refuting. That's even worse, right? So I think that really, I think Mark pointed out that, you know, it's kind of like a, you know, problem that not many people work on. But I think actually, you know, it's one of the core problems that we need to solve in order for science to be self-coherent. And then even like zooming out even more, I mean, we're all aware that, you know, our planet is precarious. It's not just us that are precarious. Future is uncertain. And there are big calls in the scientific community from climate scientists saying, hey, you know, we need to take action, we need to take responsibility for what we're doing to the planet and so on. But if at the same time, the rest of science says, hey, well, actually, we're not really sure whether normativity exists or whether everything is just like, you know, mere physical happenings. And well, what kind of message are we sending to the rest of the public, right? I mean, are we just, you know, mindless brains, like, you know, executing chemical functions? Well, in that case, well, who cares about the planet, right? I mean, you really have to like somehow make room for the possibility that there are, you know, people genuinely concerned, and that they're the way they act, they're responsible for those actions. And if science can't accommodate that, then you know, it's a big failure. And I think that so we really have to put normativity center stage and what we're thinking about. And it's an existential concern at the end of the day. You know, if you can't make room for it, you know, at the end of the day, you know, normativity might again pop out of the existence of the universe, and they'll just be happenings from then and then onwards. So yeah, for me, you know, it crosses all levels, from the origins of life to thinking about science, thinking about society. And so really it's you know, a very, very rich topic to be working on.
Excellent. That's great. Okay, Mark.
Well, I gave my simple answer a while ago, and that is that normativity absolutely saturates everything biological and everything mental in very, very complicated hierarchies, heterarchies, lattices of emergence, and so on. So I will just echo that. I do have a couple of very minor disagreements with things people said, but I prefer to echo and reinforce a few things and make some additional comments. So for example, when Alvaro was talking about the viability envelope and so on, I was reminded of Don Campbell, who talks about vicariants and surrogates. And one of his semi-tongue-in-cheek examples was that vision serves as a vicariant for the error of stepping off the cliff. You can avoid the error of stepping off the cliff if you can detect the cliff in some vicariant or surrogate manner. And you know, this goes back, of course, further. A sort of a version of the intuition is in Popper when he talks about the ability for us to construct hypotheses and let our hypotheses die in our stead. So the cliff was a Don Campbell example of that. So I very much agree with what Alvaro was talking about there, and just wanted to add that sort of historical note to it. Just to say a little bit more about this lattice of emergences. In my own work, the hierarchy goes from interactive competence to learning, to emotions, to reflective consciousness. And then there's a whole different range or level of emergence of sociality and language and social persons, and many, many side things there like perception and memory and so on and so on. So I've made some attempt to fill out a little bit of what I take to be a rather enormous organization of emergences. And then lastly, I wanted to comment and emphasize on a comment that Alvaro made that was a very brief comment, but I think is quite important. And I guess this also picks up on something that Tom said, that so far as we know, or so far as I know, normativity did emerge with life. Maybe it could emerge some other way, I don't know, but I don't know of any example of it emerging with life. But what I would like to point out is that life we tend to think of in terms of organisms. And in fact, it seems to me the emergence organization is, first of all, the self-organization of the entire biosphere, where the earth is the pan of water being maintained in a far from equilibrium condition by mostly the sun, although perhaps a little bit by radioactivity. But the earth is maintained in a far from equilibrium condition, and it self-organizes. It self-organizes in lots and lots of different ways, but part of that self-organization tends to preferentially keep around various forms of stabilities. And one thing that aids stability a lot is encapsulation, whether it be autogenic or cell walls or whatever it might be. And so there tends to be a selection for self-organization of local stabilities like that. And the local stabilities in turn are not autonomous in the sense of independent from their environments. They are made possible by their environments, and they're sort of like derivations from the environment. So it's not only the biosphere that's primary, it's also local ecosystems, although we don't often use the word in quite this broad sense. But living organisms are enabled by the local ecosystems, which is enabled by the general self-organization and produced by the general historical and evolutionary development of the biosphere. So Alvaro made a comment about this, but I just wanted to emphasize it, that there is a problem in our minds going immediately to organisms. Another problem with that, I might as well mention as long as I'm here, is that it's not always clear what the boundary of an organism is. Just like it's not always clear what the boundary of a species is. If you've got a bunch of crabgrass in a lawn, some of them still connected by runners, some of them not, some of the runners deteriorating, how many organisms are there? If you have a grove of aspen, how many trees are there? Well, you know, there's a whole bunch of different things sticking up out of the ground, but they all have a common root system. I mean, you can just go on and on and on. Boundaries are assumed in the way we talk about life, but boundaries are themselves products of dynamics. They are not metaphysically primary. And that's true at the level of organism as it is of all the rest of this stuff. So that's another aspect of the sense in which ecosystem and biosphere are really the primary frameworks in which we have to ask these questions.
Yeah, okay. It's even worse when you get to the level of microorganisms, especially bacteria. I mean,
Oh yes.
Species is. Okay, we are at 8 minutes now left in this part. So I'm gonna let. Yeah. So I'm gonna let Alvaro.
Maybe we move to a more free-flowing
Just
format.
to add, concerning the importance of this account of normativity for the whole philosophy, I remembered that there is a very nice book called Self-Constitution by Christine Korsgaard, in which she really grounds human morality in terms very similar to those that we are talking about here, just for those that are interested in the question, for the importance of this grounding at other levels.
Okay. And Tom, what were you suggesting?
That instead of going through the list of questions, I think we're already like moving, you know, into kind of a creative, rich territory that, you know, maybe it'd be time to just either let this flow in the panel or even already open it to the audience. Because I think in our talks, we kind of addressed a lot of this, and we're touching on some opening up some new topics in this conversation that might be worthwhile also exploring and we're further unfolding. But
All right.
yeah,
So does anyone want to follow up? Johanna.
Yes, I would like to follow up on the question of ascription versus description. On the one hand, we can criticize the causal mechanistic discourse and just set it aside and say, as Thomas said, well, if there's no normativity, nothing matters in science. But if we stick to that paradigm in which we are all raised, that there's something explanatory about causal mechanistic explanations and things happening because they are pushed by something that comes from the past. This is the paradigm. And if we stick to it, then I think we need to ask the normative explanations, both in Marx, but also in Terence Deacon's and also Alvaro Moreno's work, suddenly bring in the future. And this is where I always struggle. Where does the future come from? There is a need, I understand completely, to turn in the explanation to what the system will do in the future. This is encapsulated in the notion of dynamic presupposition. It comes up in Terence Deacon's projections into the future and the teleodynamics and so on. So my question to you is the claim here that somehow the future is present within the system? Or is the reference to future states not something that, and again, we go back to the observer, that the observer brings from the outside?
The question is for me, right?
It's for everybody. It's for you, for Mark, for Terence Deacon in particular.
My brief answer. Yes, it is present in the system because there is a kind of circularity. And the circularity means that I consider a part, a functional part, as something that has been produced, is there, produced within a network of causal processes, and this entity or process or structure has some effects, and these effects contribute to the production or the existence of other parts and so on, until ultimately this part is there because of what it does. The heart is there because it pumps blood. This is the trivial, the classical example, but it's this sense. Now, you can take different scales of time. It's not the same the scale of time for the metabolic organization of, say, a unicellular system, the intercellular metabolic organization of a multicellular system, or even when you consider an ecological system in which there is the contribution a much more long time of each of population of type of population of organisms doing such and such things that contributes to their maintenance through the generation and so on. So, but all that plays some role because life is a very complicated system in which you can consider different scale times. But yes, the answer is the future in this sense plays a role, a crucial role, because there is the idea of function, normative function, because it's something that is there because what the effects it does.
All right, Terry.
Yeah, let me pull my hand down here just for a second. That I actually think this is the critical question actually behind all of process theory. And that is process theory assumes time. Time is the great mystery. There's a place where I've talked about time as a consequence of necessary incompleteness. That is, I think causal closure is a mistake. That causality is Gödelian in the sense that in a sense the world is never complete. It has to, you know, I'd say change itself, change. And this is a problem with all the very physical theories of time we have. They assume time. If you take sort of Einsteinian sort of block universe where we sort of move through these stages in time, the moving is also assuming time. So, you're explaining time by assuming time. There's a deep paradox in the concept of time. And I like the old view that goes back to the beginning of vitalism and the concept of durée. That is that essential to the notion of process is duration. That is, there is no instantaneous. And yet we can talk about instantaneous velocities, for example. We know that a projectile thrown in the air has an instantaneous velocity, although the concept of velocity is time and space. But if you have an instant, there's no time. How could you have velocity? So we have this sort of paradox that we trap ourselves in when we talk about, the calculus of movement and that sort of thing. And it goes all the way back, of course, this kind of paradox goes deep back. The point I want to make here is that this is where the second law of thermodynamics, I think, is important. I don't believe the second law of thermodynamics is what causes time. Again, time, I think, is beyond that. We use time to actually talk about that asymmetry. But in fact, when you take a process or a durée perspective, that nothing is instantaneous, then what happens is that there's this disposition of the universe we call the second law, which is things breaking down. And instantaneously, at every moment, a living system is oriented or projected in the opposite direction. It's not that future is causing the past. It's that at every moment, there's these two, in a sense, inverse arrows of durée. One is pointing, as we might say, forward. The other is pointing backwards, in a sense. And at every moment, they're in play. And I think that's part of the reason that the universe has this sort of intrinsic incompleteness that we call time.
All right, Mark?
Two comments, I guess. One is issues of ethics have been coming up. And I just want to point out that there is, in fact, a model of ethics as emergent in the later part of the book that we haven't gotten to yet. Whether right or wrong, I don't know, but it is something that I address. And I attempt to claim that this model of ethics can handle things like ethical obligations to ecosystems and to the biosphere and et cetera, which it seems to me that a lot of other ethical systems have trouble doing. With respect to time, yes, it is sort of the fundamental mystery. The person whose approach I'm appreciating most so far is Rovelli, who is doing descendant of loop quantum gravity. And he points out a couple of things. I won't bother to try to give his arguments at all, but one is that in general relativity, there is no background time. There's certainly no preferred dimension of time. And he proposes to simply get rid of time as a variable within the theory. And the reason he thinks he can do that depends entirely on the fact that the theory is background independent. Now, one of the things that follows from being background independent is that everything is relational. We can get into that, and Rovelli focuses on that quite strongly. So just to give you a bit of an intuitive hint about where he's trying to go with this, he claims that we get a differentiation between two directions of time from the non-commutativity in quantum theory, that you measure in one, measure A, measure B isn't the same as measure B and then measure A. So the non-commutativity there gives you a distinction between different directions of time. Which or what, if anything, will pick out one of those directions as being future and the other as past. And Rovelli proposes what he calls thermal time, which gets back to thermodynamics. I frankly don't entirely agree with his arguments here, but they are the best I've come across so far. And just to give you a hint of how he tries to account for time without a time variable, he talks about what he calls proto-observables or partial observables. So a partial observable might be a location of something, and another partial observables are not observable all by themselves. the only thing that you can observe is coincidences of partial observables. So if you have a particle come together with some other trajectory in space-time, in general relativity, one of those can serve as a clock for the other one. So you get these kind of local measures of time in terms of the coincidences of these partial observables. This, of course, can get extremely complicated when you try to do it without any background assumption of time. And like I say, I don't completely agree with all of his arguments here, but it gives you a sense in which you can have a process metaphysics, which Rovelli explicitly argues for, without simply completely presupposing time as a metaphysical background.
Right, Itai?
Or Phil, do we want to ask Johanna to reiterate? She seems to want maybe to clarify what she's actually asking about.
Ah, yeah, that'd be a good idea.
I'm
Johanna?
sorry. This is very kind. It is somehow I got myself misunderstood. I was not asking about time, even though this was terrifically interesting. I was basically asking this from my point of view, the switch from causal to functional explanation hinges, and this is also present in your texts, that we suddenly feel entitled to take into account what the system does in the future and not only in the past. Now, Alvaro has explained, I think, very nicely. He said, well, somehow, you know, you can't distinguish anymore. That which happened in the past is also what we can somehow draw on in the future. In a sense, you said in the last, in your last response, we need to draw on the future in order to run the functional explanation. But I wanted to dig a little deeper here and say, according to your explanations, or to your justifications of why we are entitled to suddenly introduce the functional idiom, it is that you bring in the future. And this is the part that puzzles me. Is the future present in the system, or is the future that you draw on in your explanation when you use dynamical presupposition or teleodynamics and so on, is that something that you bring from the outside? That was the question.
In some sense, I would say yes. In some sense, yes. It is hard to be more concrete, but let me add something that I have mentioned in my presentation. One question. There is this creativity in the fact that the constraints forming a web self-determine, so they construct, they constitute some form of organization, they become agents, they become a kind of proliferating entities with their own purpose. And yes, this has a sense of future, of course, because they are need to do that in order to maintain their identity. And this identity, in some sense, they at the same time they modify their identity. I want not to say that there is something completely fixed, because it is paradoxical. They have an identity. This identity makes things, and through these things, that this identity is modifying. That's why there is historicity. Of course, historicity is not to be the same thing, the same organization all the time. So yes. But this is an open question, very complex. But this is what is the characteristic of living entities. And this is something that has a profound, deep difference with the sense in which we speak in terms of evolution of the history of the Earth, of the history of the universe, of the history of the stars. We also speak in that term, but it's a completely different meaning, because they are not individual agents in some sense, with their own telos. by the idea of telos. And that's, in some sense, I consider myself as Aristotelian, in some sense, naturalistic Aristotelian, so to speak. And also the idea of autonomy in the sense of Kant, the morality of Kant. We are doing what we are constructing ourselves. That's what I can say.
Sorry. Thank you very much for that, Itai.
Yes, thanks. Well, I want to say first that, you know, I really like and appreciate this this direction, right, of trying to account for normativity in terms of, you know, far from equilibrium, thermodynamics, and all the things that come with it. I think is beautiful, but I nevertheless would like maybe to press something as a question. I guess, I mean, all of you, perhaps with the exception of Tom, seems to think that normativity on the scale of emergence is something that arises prior to experience, consciousness, feelings, things like that. And I think we go back to Tom. He mentioned at some point that the rationale behind why we care about normativity is that, you know, without it, nothing would matter, right? So this idea that things matter. Now, at least in our normal speech, when we, or the way we think of it, when we think of something like this, we think of norms and values, we think of them in terms of care, concern, right? Regard for something. And the dictionary tells us that regard, it actually says quite beautifully, is a kindly feeling, notice, right? Which springs from a consideration of estimable qualities. It seems to me that you, most of you at least, try to make sense of this idea of concern for, or consideration for estimable qualities, right? For things that matter, yet without the feeling aspect, right? And my question is, I mean, so because in the precarious existence in far from thermodynamic equilibrium, so we find systems that must do something, and therefore they de facto treat certain processes, certain goals as important or as goals, and yet without feeling anything. Now, I think many would struggle to think that something like the big red spot, the giant storm system on where is it, in Jupiter, right, which is a storm system, that something like this actually cares about anything, right? And so I guess we know, I mean, my question is, perhaps we're moving too fast here, in the sense that we know that you could assume that microorganism, I mean, many people believe that microorganisms perhaps don't feel anything, and yet that they have the normativity in this minimal sense. We know that there is continuity. The assumption is that there is evolution, and at the end we come to creatures like ourselves, which we know feel something, right? But if we imagine a world in which there was no experience at all, why would nobody would care about anything in this sense of being? Why would it be really normative? Is it not that because we know that there is continuity, we assume that this must be the humble beginning, and yet we assume that it doesn't have this element? I guess that's the intuition that I'm having here. I don't believe I can make it much more precise right now, but any reaction or thought about it from at least some of you, I just wonder.
Yeah, just to say that I agree with you, you know, I don't want any kind of zombie notion of normativity, right? So kind of like normativity where the system there's absolutely nothing going on. I think it's kind of empty. In that case, it seems like it's not really doing its job properly. So then, you know, I would apply Occam's razor almost and say we don't really need it. You know, we can just talk about the system in purely physical terms. You know, and of course, as a heuristic, we can say, okay, this is a function that, you know, did this and so on, and then we kind of simplify our explanation. But it seems like it's not doing any like role in it, difference in its own terms. So, you know, we have to be very careful not to impute some sort of like, you know, human consciousness into like these very simple systems. But if there's no sense for, you know, something going right, something going wrong, however primitive that might be, then, you know, maybe we're not talking about something that's living, I would say.
All righty, Richard. Sorry. Richard?
You're
Campbell?
muted, Richard.
You're still muted.
I don't know why it wouldn't work. I want to go back to the point raised by Joanna. If we think of causation as involving some temporality, in other words, no causes, it's not the case that all causes happen simultaneously with their effects. Already, therefore, you've got temporality built in. Because temporality is even built in looking backwards at causation, then when considering what might happen next, inevitably we're projecting into a future. This is where I think it's important to pick up Mark's way of talking about serving a function in terms of usefulness, of what works. Because if something works for us, then we've discovered that it's worked for us. Something can serve the function of usefulness that we have in order to achieve our objective. Then we can use that past experience already projecting into a future. I think this is how the future gets into the story. I don't know whether you find that helpful comment, but that's the way I touch on this a bit from what I'm going to say tomorrow morning.
Okay, Mark.
A couple of comments. I think it's a very difficult question to answer, especially when we think of it in terms of the wording of the future per se. But it seems to me that the question changes a bit and becomes more amenable if we think of it in terms of possibility, modal potentialities. Modal potentialities are still not part of our standard universe of cause, factual relations, and particles. But I would argue that modal possibilities are an essential realm of understanding and explanation. And we could get into that as its own side comment if you'd like at some point. But yes, the notion of function brings in necessarily modal possibilities, but it doesn't create a focus on modal possibilities. So for example, the organization of quantum fields that constitutes a hydrogen atom also involves modal possibilities. It involves the persistence of that particular organization into the future as a possibility that is strongly selected for, unless and until sufficient energy happens to impinge upon it. So there is issues of modality even down at the level of fundamental physics. And talking about functions, yes, brings it in a different way, but I don't think it's brand new to bring it in at all. And that brings me to sort of a more general comment on some of what Tom was saying. Tom is trying to create a space for subjectivity to have a consequence. or normativity or something like that to have a consequence. And the claim is that there is a realm, or at least a potential realm, of indeterminism in macro processes, like the macro processes that constitute you and me. And I completely agree with that. And as a matter of fact, I would point to Bishop, who's made a similar point, Kane, who makes a similar point with respect to ethics, and some of my own work, which has made an argument to that. Most of these discussions, Bishop, Kane, and so on, have to do with free will. They don't necessarily have to do with consciousness. So the issue there is to capture certain aspects of free will, such as essential indeterminism, and show that it's consistent with contemporary physics. And I completely agree with that, but I wouldn't say that, I think I diverge from what Tom is arguing in the sense that it doesn't give you a whole that something like subjectivity can fill, that something like subjectivity is then what determines the physicalistically indeterministic process. It makes the macro process of thinking and decision-making and so on intrinsically indeterministic, or at least potentially so. I think that's actually a resource that organisms can call up upon, namely the resource of entering into indeterministic, chaotic, unpredictable kinds of processes for the sake of their being unpredictable and indeterministic, and for certain purposes that itself can be quite useful and functional. So I attempt to account for subjectivity and consciousness in a reflective sense, as well as consciousness in a non-reflective sense in other ways. And they certainly can make use of and can be involved with these issues of indeterminacy. But I don't think I agree with Tom about the indeterminacy giving you a lacuna that subjectivity somehow fills in.
Thank you very much, Mark, for your comments. In fact, one time I was supposed to visit you for a couple of days and talk in depth about this. So it's good that we're, finally managing to catch up on this point, because I did see, in your work that there's some possible overlap in our thinking here. So I will look at the references that you point me to. So
can I interrupt you for just 1 second?
Yeah.
This is going to be our last comment, just so everybody knows.
Okay. All right.
ahead.
So I'll do it quick. So I'll check the references. So about the lacuna, yeah, I think, even for Hans Jonas, I think one of the advantages of moving forward a little bit with this is that he couldn't find a way of how having an increase in stochasticity could do any useful work. And I think there, at least, complex systems theory has moved enough forward so that we now have frameworks where we can dump all that, extra stochasticity in and say, hey, that's going to create useful consequences down the line. So at least that part wasn't really available to previous theorists in this sense. So yeah, I mean, it doesn't solve everything, but one thing that I would like to avoid is just to have some kind of identity theory where whether it's constraints or some extra higher level of hierarchy or something like that, and then we're saying, hey, that's what we mean by normativity. Because then, people who are eliminativists can always come in and say, well, why? Why don't we just stay with the bottom layer? And because it already does all the causal work for us, we don't need this extra stuff, right? And so in order to avoid that move, I would like to have a slight decoupling, partial decoupling between these two domains. And that's why I want to have a lacuna of what you mean, what you mentioned. So yeah, it's not worked out, but there are some motivations for trying to make that gap. Thank you. Well, we should talk more about it in another occasion.
Well, guys,
Yeah, we have lunch. We have lunch now. So anybody who wants to stick around and chat, we can continue the conversation if you'd like. If you're awake enough to do so.
Our next session is in 1 hour and 40 minutes. So yeah, we could talk a little bit more if we're onto something.
Yeah, we were just, we're like 10 minutes over time now, so I didn't want to.
Maybe we should copy paste the program into the chat so that people can see, because there are different time zones in the program. that people can refer to.
Yeah.
I said 1 hour, 40 minutes. What 1 hour and a half from now, we'll be starting again.
Okay, sure.
Here, I actually have an image of the.
Sorry, people. I have to excuse myself. It's almost 1:30 in the morning over here, and you know, I'm starting to notice that my talking is becoming less fluid. So, you know, it's been a great pleasure chatting with all of you, and you know, I hope that the next iteration of this conference, maybe there'll be opportunity to join you in person and you know, talk through some of these topics a little bit more in depth. I would very much enjoy that.
Yeah.
So thank you very much for listening and being such a great audience.
Thank
Thanks,
you for
Mark.
joining us.
In
May
my
I
case,
say-
in my case, and I have an appointment now.
Thanks.
Okay.
May I say it's
See you later.
Yep.
It's
Thank
2:22
you
in the
for joining.
morning.